In a village huddled at the foot of ancient, sleeping mountains, there lived a bull who had forgotten the shape of his own strength. His name was Ferdinand, though few bothered to use it anymore. He was a creature of immense history, his hide a roadmap of forgotten battles, and his horns, once the pride of the village, now blunted by time and the rough bark of lonely trees. The villagers saw him as a relic, a gentle giant put out to his final pasture, a patch of land that bordered the deep, shadowed woods where whispers were born. They saw a slow, heavy beast, a monument to a past they no longer celebrated. But one person saw something else. A 12-year-old boy named Leo, small for his age, with eyes that held the quiet depth of the forest itself, saw a king in exile. While other children's games were filled with noise and motion, Leo's world was one of silent observation. He watched Ferdinand from the splintered fence that separated the village from the wild, seeing not a useless elder, but a lonely heart beating inside a mountain of muscle. He saw the flicker of life in the bull's dark, liquid eyes, a spark the rest of the world had allowed to grow dim. The village lived under an unspoken treaty of fear with the woods. They took what they needed, but never lingered. They respected its power, which was another word for being terrified of it. The stories of wolves, old and new, were woven into the lullabies of their children, a constant, low hum of caution. So when the first howl sliced through the bruised twilight, it wasn't a surprise. It was a promise kept. It was the sound of the wild coming to collect a debt, and its gaze was fixed on the old king, alone in his pasture, silhouetted against a dying sun. The howl was not a singular event. It was a catalyst, a note that summoned a chorus from the gloom of the tree line. One voice became two, then four, a harmony of hunger that slid under doorways and through the cracks in window frames. In the warm, lamplit homes of the village, conversations stopped. Spoons were frozen halfway to mouths. A collective breath was held. Every man, woman, and child knew what that sound meant and where it was coming from. It was the sound of the pack. It was the sound of judgment for the weak, the old, the isolated. Shutters were latched. Bars slid across heavy oak doors. It was a practiced ritual, a familiar retreat into the safety of their own small worlds. They were not cruel people. They were practical. They were people who understood the brutal arithmetic of nature. To intervene was to invite the chaos into their own homes, to risk their own livestock, their own children. The old bull had lived a long life. They reasoned in silence, their faces illuminated by the flickering hearths. This was the way of things, a sad but necessary end. From his small bedroom window, Leo watched the darkness come alive. He saw the shadows detach themselves from the greater shadow of the forest, sleek, fluid shapes moving with a terrifying purpose. He could see Ferdinand, a great dark island in a sea of grass, his massive head raised, nostrils flaring. The old bull was not running. He couldn't. His world had shrunk to this single patch of land, and he would defend it. Leo watched as Ferdinand lowered his head, the worn tips of his horns aimed at the approaching threat. A low guttural rumble started deep in his chest, a sound of defiance that seemed to shake the very ground. It was the sound of a king remembering his crown, even as his kingdom was about to be overrun. But the wolves were masters of their craft. They fanned out, a closing net of teeth and snarls, testing, feinting, their yellow eyes glowing like embers in the gathering dark. One would dart in, and as Ferdinand swung his immense head to meet it, another would snap at his flank. It was a dance of death, slow and merciless. Leo's heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the rising symphony of the attack. He saw the first lunge that connected, saw the giant shudder, a tremor of pain that Leo felt in his own bones. And in that moment, the village's logic, the cold arithmetic of survival, dissolved into a single blazing thought: they were wrong. The voice of his father echoed in his mind, a mantra of caution drilled into him since birth. The forest has its own laws, Leo. You don't interfere. You don't challenge it. You stay inside. He could feel the weight of that fear, the collective terror of the village pressing down on him. trying to pin him to the spot behind the safety of the glass. He saw the pack leader, a brute of a wolf, larger than the others, with a silvery gray mantle that seemed to shimmer with malevolence. It was this wolf that directed the assault, a patient general waiting for the perfect moment to strike the final blow. Leo watched as Ferdinand, bleeding now from a dozen shallow cuts, stumbled. His defiant roar was becoming weaker. Laced with exhaustion and pain, the old bull sank to one knee. His eyes, for a moment, seemed to find Leo's window, a silent plea across the dying light. And something inside the boy broke. It was the dam of obedience, of fear, of feeling small and helpless. What flooded through was a tide of pure, unthinking love for the lonely creature he had watched for so many hours. He was not a hero. He was not a warrior. He was just a boy who could not bear to watch a friend die alone. He turned from the window, his movements sudden and sharp. He didn't have a plan. He had only an imperative. Down the narrow stairs he flew, a whisper of motion. He ignored his mother's startled cry from the kitchen. The front door was barred. His small hands fumbled with the heavy wooden beam, his knuckles scraping against the rough grain. He finally heaved it free. The cold night air hit him like a physical blow, carrying the scent of blood and pine and wild aggression. To his right, a shepherd's brazier from earlier in the day still held a nest of glowing coals. Without hesitating, Leo plunged a thick, fallen branch into its heart. It took a terrifyingly long moment to catch, then it erupted into a primitive torch, spitting sparks and casting a frantic, dancing light. Armed with nothing but a stick on fire and a heart full of desperate courage, Leo ran. He ran towards the snarling, the growling, the sounds that had paralyzed an entire village. He ran towards the fight, a small boy with a burning branch held aloft, his own thin shout tearing through the air, a sound so unexpected, so utterly out of place, that for a single, stunned second, the entire battleground fell silent. The wolves turned as one. Their hunt, their ancient ritual, was interrupted by the most impossible of apparitions. A small, screaming human, wielding a star of fire, charging directly at them. The pack leader's lip curled back from its teeth in a silent snarl, its yellow eyes narrowing, trying to process this bizarre defiance. This was not the behavior of prey. This was not the behavior of the fearful villagers who hid behind their walls. This was an anomaly, a disruption to the natural order, and it was unnerving. For Leo, the world had shrunk to the space between him and the alpha wolf. The fear was a cold, sharp thing in his gut, but the fire in his hand gave him a strange, borrowed courage. He didn't stop running. He thrust the torch forward, a wild arc of flame and smoke, and let out another raw, ragged scream that came from the very bottom of his soul. He was no longer Leo, the quiet boy. He was a protector. He was Ferdinand's only hope. He planted his feet in the damp earth, a tiny, determined figure standing between the wounded bull and the circle of predators. The torchlight illuminated the scene in a hellish, flickering tableau. The silver-backed alpha, the tense muscles of the pack, the steaming breath in the cold air, and the great, fallen bull struggling to rise behind him. The standoff lasted for an eternity, contained in a few heartbeats. The alpha took a half step forward, a low growl rumbling in its chest. It was a test. Leo, trembling but resolute, jabbed the torch forward again, sparks showering onto the dry grass near the wolf's paws. The wolf flinched back from the heat. It was the fire, not the boy, that it respected. Fire was an unpredictable enemy, a primal force of pain and destruction. The alpha looked from the boy's blazing eyes to the unpredictable fire, then back to the wounded bull. The calculation was no longer simple. The element of surprise was gone. The risk had increased exponentially. With a final, frustrated snarl, a sound of thwarted ambition, the pack leader gave a subtle signal. One by one, the shadows melted back towards the tree line, their glowing eyes fixed on Leo until they were swallowed by the darkness. They were not defeated, merely postponed. They vanished as quickly as they had appeared, leaving behind only the scent of their wildness and a silence that was heavier and more profound than any sound. Leo stood there for a long time, his small chest heaving, the torchlight casting his long, trembling shadow over the grass. The fire began to sputter, its job done, its light fading back into the deep twilight. The adrenaline that had propelled him forward began to drain away, leaving a hollow, shaking weakness in its place. He was alone now, truly alone in the pasture with the wounded giant. The silence was absolute. Even the crickets seemed to be holding their breath. Slowly, cautiously, he turned. Ferdinand was still on the ground, but he had managed to push himself up onto his belly. His massive head was raised, and his dark, deep eyes were fixed on Leo. There was no aggression in them. There was no madness of pain. There was only a look of profound, weary, and utter astonishment. For the first time, Leo felt a new kind of fear. Not of wolves, but of the enormous creature before him. He had acted on instinct, on love, but now, in the quiet aftermath, he was just a small boy with a very large, very wounded, and very powerful animal. He took one hesitant step forward. The bull didn't move. Another step. The bull let out a soft, low sound, a puff of air from its huge nostrils. It wasn't a threat. It was a sigh. It was a question. Leo dropped what was left of the torch. He walked forward until he was just a few feet away, his own smallness thrown into sharp relief by the sheer scale of the bull. Have you ever felt a connection so deep it transcends words? A moment where two completely different souls recognize each other. That was this moment. Leo, slowly, so slowly, reached out his hand, palm open, a universal gesture of peace. He laid his trembling fingers on the bull's broad, scarred forehead, right between his eyes. The hide was coarse, warm, and vibrating with the tremors of exhaustion, and under his touch, the great animal relaxed. A shudder went through its massive frame, not of pain, but of release. Ferdinand leaned his head into the boy's touch, a fraction of an inch, an immense gesture of trust. In that moment, in the darkness of the forgotten pasture, a bond was forged. Not in fire, but in the quiet that followed. It was a silent promise between a boy who had found his courage and a bull who had found a reason to live. The journey back was a slow, painful procession. Leo, with one hand still resting on Ferdinand's neck, began to walk, his voice a soft, steady murmur. "It's okay. We're going home. You're safe now." The bull, leaning on the boy for a strength that was more spiritual than physical, heaved himself to his feet. Each step was a monumental effort, a testament to his pain and his will. As they emerged from the darkness of the pasture and into the faint gray light spilling from the edge of the village, the first door creaked open. An old woman peered out, her face a mask of disbelief. Then another door, and another. It was as if the village was waking from a trance. The silence was broken by gasps. They saw the impossible sight, the small, quiet boy they all knew, leading the wounded, bloodied bull they had all abandoned. He walked with a new kind of stillness, a confidence that hadn't been there at sunset. The bull, in turn, walked with a docile trust that defied its fearsome size and injuries. Shame is a powerful motivator. It washed over the faces of the villagers as they stepped out of their homes, their lanterns now seeming like beacons of cowardice. They saw the gashes on Ferdinand's flanks, the exhaustion in his gait, and the unwavering loyalty of the child at his side. They had listened to their fear, while a boy had listened to his heart. Leo's father was the last to emerge. He ran towards them, his face a storm of conflicting emotions, terror for his son's safety, astonishment at his bravery, and a deep, gut-wrenching pride that left him breathless. He didn't shout. He didn't scold. He simply stopped in front of his son, looked at the boy's steady hand on the bull's neck, and then met Leo's eyes. "Leo," he said, his voice thick with emotion. And that was all. It was enough. The village doctor, a practical woman named Alara, who also served as its veterinarian, was summoned. She came with a bag of remedies and a look of stern concentration, but her eyes softened when she saw Leo refusing to leave Ferdinand's side. whispering reassurances as she cleaned and stitched the wounds under the collective, silent gaze of the entire village. The days that followed were a quiet testament to the new order of things. Ferdinand's recovery was slow, but it was anchored by the unwavering presence of his small savior. The village, moved by a collective sense of responsibility, moved the bull from his lonely, outlying pasture to a small, protected meadow right in the heart of their community. A new, sturdy fence was built, not to keep him in, but to keep danger out. It was a fence built of apology and respect. Every morning before school and every afternoon after, Leo was there. He brought Ferdinand buckets of fresh, cool water. He'd find the sweetest patches of clover and hand-feed them to the gentle giant. He would sit for hours, leaning against Ferdinand's warm, solid bulk, reading a book aloud or simply talking about his day. The bull, in turn, began to show a personality that no one had ever bothered to look for. He was patient, intelligent, and deeply affectionate. He would recognize the sound of Leo's footsteps long before the boy came into view, his great head lifting in anticipation. He would nudge Leo's shoulder with a gentleness that was breathtaking for a creature of his size, a soft reminder of his presence. Alara, the vet, would often stop by to check on her patient, but she found herself observing the boy as much as the bull. "Courage is a strange thing," she told Leo's father one afternoon, watching as Leo carefully brushed a stubborn burr from Ferdinand's tail. "It's not the absence of fear, it's acting in spite of it. Your son didn't just save a bull, you know. He reminded us all of something we'd forgotten." Ferdinand's physical wounds began to heal, the angry red lines fading into silver scars that simply added to the tapestry of his long life. But the deeper healing was in his spirit. The lonely, vacant look in his eyes was replaced by one of calm contentment. He was no longer a relic. He was a resident. He was loved. And this love was his medicine, more potent than any salve or stitch. He had found his herd, and its leader was a 12-year-old boy. The story of the boy and the bull became a new kind of village folklore. It wasn't a cautionary tale about the dangers of the forest. It was an inspirational one about the power of a single compassionate act. The children of the village, who had once given Ferdinand's pasture a wide berth, now came to the fence of his new meadow, not to gawk, but to pay respects. They would bring him apples and carrots, holding them out on flattened palms, their initial fear melting away as the huge, gentle head would lower to softly lip the treat from their hands. Leo was no longer the invisible boy, the quiet observer in the background. He walked through the village with a gentle confidence that had nothing to do with arrogance and everything to do with purpose. The other boys didn't tease him for being small or quiet anymore. They looked at him with a kind of awe. He was the boy who had faced down wolves. He was Ferdinand's friend. The most significant change, however, came from the village elder, a man named Thomas, whose pragmatism was as old and weathered as the mountains themselves. He had been the staunchest proponent of the let nature take its course philosophy. One crisp autumn afternoon, he walked to Ferdinand's meadow, his back straight, his face unreadable. Leo watched from a distance as the old man stood before the old bull. Thomas didn't say a word. He simply reached into a sack he was carrying and pulled out a block of rock salt, the kind reserved for the most prized livestock. He placed it carefully just inside the fence. Then he looked at Ferdinand, held his gaze for a long moment, and gave a slow, deliberate nod. It was a gesture of profound respect. It was an apology. It was an admission that the boy's wisdom had surpassed the elders. In that quiet moment, Ferdinand's redemption was complete. He was no longer a symbol of the village's past, but a guardian of its conscience, a living monument to the day a boy taught them all that the bravest heart is often the most compassionate. Life settled into a new, peaceful rhythm. The bond between Leo and Ferdinand became a part of the village landscape, as natural and constant as the rising sun. But the forest remained. Its memory was long, and its hunger was patient. One late afternoon, as the village was busy with the chores of the coming evening, a new kind of cry pierced the air. It wasn't the howl of a wolf, but the terrified shriek of a child. A little girl, no older than 5, had wandered from her yard, chasing a butterfly. She had passed through a gap in the old outer fence and was now standing at the edge of the woods, dangerously close to the deep shadows where the pack had last been seen. Panic erupted. Her mother screamed her name. Men dropped their tools and started running, their shouts adding to the chaos. But before any of them could get close, a sound tore through the village that stopped everyone in their tracks. It was a bellow, a deep, earth-shaking roar that came from Ferdinand's meadow. It was not a sound of pain or fear, but of pure protective authority. The old bull was on his feet, his body rigid, his head held high and pointed directly at the forest's edge. He let out another thunderous roar, a warning that echoed off the mountains. He was a king, reclaiming his domain, drawing a line in the sand with the sheer force of his voice. Leo, hearing the commotion, saw what was happening instantly. He didn't run towards the frantic parents. He ran towards the little girl, his eyes on Ferdinand. The bull stood like a statue, his gaze locked on the tree line, a sentinel. It was as if he were providing cover, his immense presence, a shield against whatever might be lurking in the shadows. Guided by Ferdinand's unwavering focus, Leo reached the child, scooping her up into his arms just as her father arrived, breathless and pale. The danger had passed, but everyone knew what had happened. The bull had been the first to sense the danger, the first to react. He had repaid his debt. He was not just Leo's friend, he was the village's guardian. Years unfolded like the slow turning of pages. The seasons changed, painting the mountains in hues of green, gold, and white. Leo grew from a boy into a tall, quiet young man, his bond with Ferdinand only deepening with the passage of time. The bull grew ancient, his movements slow and deliberate, his great body weathered by 1,000 suns. The silver on his muzzle spread, and his dark eyes held the deep, peaceful wisdom of a life lived to its fullest. He was no longer a king in exile or a guardian on alert, but a patriarch at peace. The village children who had once feared him now brought their own children to the meadow fence to see the legendary bull and hear the story of his rescue. It had become their founding myth, a parable of courage and kindness. Our story ends here, on a warm summer evening, with the sun sinking behind the mountains, spilling a palette of orange and purple across the sky. Leo, now a young man, sits leaning against Ferdinand's side. The bull's rhythmic breathing is a slow, steady drumbeat, a sound of profound tranquility. There are no words between them. There don't need to be. Their friendship exists in the comfortable silence, in the shared space, in the history that binds them together. One saved a life, and the other saved a soul. Have you ever wondered what legacy you will leave behind? Will it be in the things you build, or the hearts you touch? The story of Leo and Ferdinand became a quiet reminder that true strength isn't about the power you wield, but about the protection you offer. It's about recognizing the value in a life that others have discarded. It's about the courage to run towards the darkness, not with a weapon, but with a light. In a small village at the foot of ancient mountains, an old bull lived out his final years not in loneliness, but surrounded by love, a gentle king in his peaceful kingdom, all because one small boy decided that his life was worth fighting for, and that single act of courage became a light that never, ever went out.